Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The names of 1987 tell us a little bit about that year. Oliver North, Bernard Goetz, Ivan Boesky, Jim Baker, Baby M, Gary Hart, Jessica McClure, Dow Jones, Robert Bork, Douglas Ginsburg, Mikhail Gorbachev. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, before we take that leap into 1988, we'll look back at 1987, some of the news, some of the news makers. Our panelists today are Ball State University professors Cecil Bohannon from economics, Bill Mosier from marketing, and John Rouse, executive producer and political science faculty member. John, we're a program of political and economic analysis. If we can separate the political economy, what was 1987? A year of politics or a year of economics?
Well, it was both. It was both economics and politics. It's very difficult to separate the two. The question is often asked, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Does politics come first or does economics come first? I think usually politics will make legitimate the economics. But certainly for the next year, in 1988, politics will come first. It'll be a very uncertain kind of arrangement because definitely we're going to change presidents. So for the next year, in 88, politics will come first. It'll be a very exciting, very uncertain kind of year. So the economics, because of the politics will be so uncertain, the economics will also be uncertain. But if you go back a couple of months ago with the stock market crash, or whatever you call it, Cecil,
right.
That has led to some of the political uncertainty. So you're going to have both economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, if for no other reason because of the election.
Well, you know, the hallmark of 1987, it seemed to me, would be, from an economic perspective, the stock market crash. That's the thing everyone's going to remember 20 years from now as to what 1987 was all about. And I think you're absolutely right. The thing that happened with that is we got a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I mean, uncertainty led to the stock market crash, but the stock market crash also contributed to uncertainty. So it seems to me we've got a very interesting thing for the 88 election. This would be the first year that I can remember where we end up going into an election with absolute uncertainty as to whether we're going to have prosperity, recession. We don't know what's going to be happening in 88.
Obviously, the crash was a turning point. We don't know what the direction is.
That's right.
It's pivotal, and I think we can probably go back and reflect on it and see some things that changed significantly. But they're still doing this, you know, it's almost moving along at a static basis rather than changing radically away from that.
Sure.
So it is dealing with uncertainty.
The economy's been going sideways all through 87. 87 was not particularly, quote, a banner year in that you had huge growth rates or enormous declines in the unemployment rate or anything like that. What you had was a slight gradual upsurge in the rate of inflation. You had very small decreases in the unemployment rate, levels of unemployment that almost would be considered to be full employment. I mean, it was a good year that way. National output went up. It was a good year. No question of that. But again, the hallmark of it, I think, was all the uncertainty.
There was some stability up until October, there wasn't there?
Oh, sure.
I mean, it was solid. There was a confidence there that perhaps we don't have now.
It sounds like Herbert Hoover to say the underlying conditions of the economy in the United States are sound, but in some sense they were. What happened with the stock market crash, I think, is a portent of underlying long-run structural problems people were worried about.
Wasn't this, though, to some degree, we'd been so long, even though it was going sideways, the economy, we'd been so long both within Indiana and nationally where we were sustained growth, or at least sustained lack of recession, we'll say, that it was almost like a tightrope walking act. You wonder when the person's going to fall off. You get so far out there that there's a little apprehension, and maybe that's part of what the stock market crash involved.
It's sort of the law of bad news. You can't have good news forever. Something's got to go rotten eventually. The pessimist eventually is going to be right, because eventually markets will go down.
Yeah, if we go back to 1981, where President Reagan and the Congress had not a political majority, but he had a philosophical majority. And since the philosophical majority of the tax cut in 1981, there's been consistent economic gradual improvement of the economy, it seems. All right, from 81 to 87, there was economic growth. In '87, as you say, there appears to be some question about economic growth. And so the politics then responding to that uncertainty also becomes uncertain. It's been said that Nixon said that the politics of his era made Keynesians out of everyone. Well, we can also say that because of the deficit, the politics of the Reagan era is making political conservatives out of every politician.
You mean it's making supply-siders out of everyone?
No, it's conservatives in the sense that the politicians are very careful as to how they decide what government should do in terms of government spending. I mean, they're very careful about what government should do, whether it's domestically or from an international point of view. So they are conservative when it comes to the role of government.
They're conservative in their verbalization, if not their actions.
Both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, like I said,
they talk it more than they implement it, though there's still a lot of votes that end up being more on the liberal side, even though when they're making speeches and that sort of thing, it's more conservative.
Yeah, it's what you're getting at. There's just an agenda difference. That all the Reagan Revolution really did was change the agenda. Well, compared to saying, okay, how can we expand government? The question now becomes, since we have the structural deficit, how can we reduce the deficit, which automatically focuses everyone's attention on cutting spending?
So the deficit has made economic conservatives out of all politicians.
Yeah, I see what you're
saying. They
saying.
don't have any choice.
It structurally makes them.
Structurally, they don't have any choice.
Because how can you, in the presence of a $180 billion deficit or whatever, propose a $50 billion spending program?
Well,
very difficult to do.
Which economic factor is going to be the factor in politics in '88? The fact that a Reagan Republican tax cut in '81 had such an effect on our economy, or the fact that perhaps it contributed to a deficit that has given us some of the problems we have now? I mean, it seems if Republicans take credit for one, they need to take blame for the other.
Ox you want to gore. If you're a candidate campaigning in New Hampshire where there's a low unemployment rate and a lot of growth, what are you going to say? You're going to say Reaganomics is the greatest thing since sliced toast, and I support it. If you're in Iowa where the economy's in a recession, you might not be likely to do that. I suppose, what would we say about Indiana in this? Indiana would be an encapsulation of the average nationally.
Middle America, really?
Middle America. How have we
I think it is, and because something we've talked about in this program before, Indiana is really the one that is moving somewhat away from manufacturing towards service, and so it is really representing some of the direction that the economy is taking. So I'd see it as being the middle ground in that respect.
And so if you're a Republican politician, John, and you were in Indiana, would you be defending supply-side economics and Reaganomics?
I don't know what supply-side economics is. I mean, that's...
Well, what I mean is the Reagan Revolution. Would you be saying that all of this was good and we're happy we did it?
As long as there's economic growth, politicians are going to be happy. If the economy...
Incumbent politicians,
the election issue in any election is the economic situation. I mean, that's always the issue. So if the election is one where things are going up, and it's going to be good for the politicians who are in office. If it's not going that way, it's going to be bad.
Sure.
So the issue we have to look for, the key issue we have to look for in 1988 is what is the economic picture, depending what state you're in, what part of a state you're in.
We can't ignore, when we talk about economics, so we have to look at domestically and how healthy it's been, but also what are they doing in the international arena. In other words, what has the Reagan administration accomplished in terms of our exports, because we do also, not only do we have a problem with the balance, our budget, but we also have a problem with the balance of trade, and that's another side of that business situation that I think they're going to have to wrestle with, because it's a very hot political issue as far as the deficit in trade, and do we have some sort of protectionist legislation, and I think that's going to come to a head. Indiana's made great progress in the last year, but I think nationally, we do have some serious problems in that area.
Bill, I think what the citizen is going to have to be aware of is the fact that the situation, the economic, the international, national, state situation is becoming increasingly more complex, and so what we have to have is an educated citizenry when it comes to the ballot box.
I agree
completely. So it's going to take more demands. More demands are going to be placed upon the citizen to become much more educated about public policy, and that's.
But isn't that a bit of, wishes were horses, beggars would fly? I mean, don't we all wish that, the citizenry were well informed and understood things in terms of ballot box provisions? I mean, in terms of when they are in vote. But
Now, the thing I'm trying to say is that there are going to be a lot of extraneous issues, and the issues are going to be everything from moral character to economic policy, balance of trade, and some of these issues are very complex issues, issues for the citizen to comprehend.
Well, I mean, I think with respect to international economics, to the extent the economy becomes more interdependent, and it's harder for people to understand that.
Right.
It's easier for some demagogues to use foreign investment or foreigners as the bugaboo, the scapegoat.
Well, it's a simple
the
one.
boogeyman.
It's really emotional.
Our
People
problems are
respond.
caused by these nasty foreigners.
Has the Iran-Contra affair faded totally as a political issue in '88, John?
No, I don't think so, because if you question Gary Hart's credibility on his morality, there's also a question about credibility with George Bush when it comes to the Iran-Contra situation. So credibility, wherever it is going to be an issue. And if George Bush's credibility comes through as being true, there won't be a problem.
Well, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty as of '88 as a presidential election year on both Republican and Democratic sides.
Yeah.
I mean, George Bush is no shoe-in, and Democrats seem to be in somewhat of disarray now that Gary Hart has gotten out and gotten in, and good knows.
Well, I
where he's
think in a sense, Ronald Reagan was a definitive personality, and whether you liked him or not, he believed what he believed, and you knew what he believed. By comparison, all these other folks running for office are wimps. So
political wimps.
Political wimps. Yeah.
Yeah, they may be able to beat you
Whatever
up in
that
Dark
means.
Alley, then, right?
Yeah. But so it's very difficult to tell what a particular candidate believes on a particular day in the political year.
But what it means is that there's none that really has put together what seems to be a broad enough coalition that will make them a viable candidate.
Yeah.
Any of them might, but none of them has really shown that.
Yeah, John, is there going to be, here we stand first week in January, is there going to be, by 3 months from now, a shakeout in both the Republican and Democratic Party so that some leading candidate will emerge? Would you expect to see that, or is it going to be a melee all the way to the convention?
Is that going to be a malaise all the way to the convention?
Or all the way to November?
all the way to November. March the 8th, Super Tuesday, is going to shake a number of them out. If for no other reason, they will not have as much money after that time.
Well, are we going to end up with compromise candidates? Are the Democrats going to end up with a George McGovern type, somebody who nobody completely liked, but everybody agreed on they could perhaps live with?
No, both parties are basically non-ideological, and the Democrats need someone of the flavor of Sam Nunn, in terms of being a Sam Nunn kind of Democrat, and they really have to go towards the center, but the Republicans do too. Both and the voters are also coming down that way, more so than ever before. The voters are voting based upon a non-ideological base.
Then Republicans have benefited perhaps from the Gorbachev visit, the pact between...
Somewhat, but the public opinion polls in terms of how voters identify, they still identify themselves to be Democrats. Several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the lead was narrowing. In 1985, it was something like 38% Democrat, 33% Republican. Now it's jumped up to into the mid-40s, Democrats versus Republicans. So in terms of registered voters, more people are registered to be Democrats than Republicans.
Do Democrats have any real issues? Or are they all Republican issues that Democrats are responding to?
Well, I don't think they have, well, there are so many Democrats and there are so many Republicans, I don't think at this time they have any really strong issues except issues of credibility over things like the Iran-Contra hearings. The economy seems to be pretty good, and as I said a few minutes ago, the economic issue is always the most important issue.
The tie between economics and politics, the skeptic says, well, things will be better in '88 economically because it's a presidential election year, and those people that might have some effect, whether it be the Congress, whether it be the Fed, will ensure that things don't get too bad during an election year. True or false?
There's some credence to that. And like I say, they think the thing that's unusual here is in 1988. Suppose I can't remember another election year where you really went into the election year with this much uncertainty, this much of a risk of a recession. However, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think the story in 1988 is going to be slow creeping inflation. I think that's almost inevitable. I think
There are really very, very few widely recognized economists that are calling for a recession. It's a definite minority.
Yeah, that's definitely right.
And,
I don't see that being in the cards, because what is it would generate a recession? Some kind of the classical Keynesian story. Not that I believe in Keynesian economics, but the classical Keynesian story is there's some collapse in spending. Well, that's not going to happen as long as the value of the dollar goes down, because export demand for American exports are going to rise. They rose in '87, they're going to rise again in '88 as the dollar declines, especially as the dollar continues to decline and American businesses are in better shape to penetrate foreign markets, as inevitably they will be. But what that's going to lead to, though, is an inflation. Because if foreign goods become more expensive in the United States, that will contribute to...
And higher interest rates.
That's not clear. I don't know what's going to happen to interest rate. That's going to depend...
Depends on the products that are being bought and the spending in terms of borrowing to do that.
Sure, and it depends on what the Federal Reserve is doing with its... I find it very hard for the Federal Reserve to tighten at a time like this.
The one thing that I think is going to be interesting is wait and see when the final figures come in from the just past recent Christmas season. In other words, what sort of spending did, in other words, when the numbers finally get crunched, did the retailers have a good Christmas or not? It's going to have a lot of meaning to a lot of consumers, because that's a tremendous indicator of their sense of security, their sense of confidence in the economy and that sort of thing. And right now, that's the one thing that's very, very questionable, is the consumer confidence after the stock market crash.
Well, again, I'm going to respectfully disagree with that, in that it doesn't seem to me there's been any fundamental loss of consumer confidence, and there are other factors that would mitigate whatever loss there is in consumer confidence.
But the spending has become, even during the early part of the Christmas season, became spongy.
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen the final figures, and I'm not sure if they're going to be out for some while. But my impression is it's simply the upper tier of the market. Sure, the BMWs and the Cartier watches aren't selling as well as they used to. But if you go on the floor, Kmart, people are still buying what they always buy.
If the economics become more chaotic or uncertain or whatever, how you want to phrase it, the politics will also become more chaotic. So the various politicians running for office are going to blame each other. I think again, the voter has to be very sophisticated, and it's very difficult for most voters to get away from personalities. They tend to favor either political parties or personalities. And the truth of the matter is that no political personality has all the answers. So I think what the voter has to look at and focus upon is what kinds of arguments, what kinds of consistent arguments does each candidate make throughout this campaign. It's guaranteed to be uncertain for the next year or so.
So you're saying the thread of continuity, the consistency, if there's something that they focus on something, and a lot of them pick on that or address that, then that's going to be something the consumer or the voter is going to become very aware of.
Wouldn't it be true that the voter, when we talk about we'd like to have a sophisticated voter, the voter, quote, needs to be sophisticated. But the very nature of voting, since one man's vote is really trivial in overall outcomes, in terms of influencing the overall outcome of an election, isn't it true that the typical voter doesn't have much of an incentive to be terribly well informed?
Absolutely,
which is why it is personality, catchy issues, a nice phrase is what works well for a politician.
Yeah, and again, it gets back to the individual economic status of that individual voter on election day.
So if you're a politician, you can come up with a good foreign boogeyman or something like that. That's why you can sell it as an issue.
Yeah.
It's hard to see, though, how the Democrats are going to be able to come up with a good economic issue that could potentially defeat the Republicans in the absence of some kind of recession.
It's not only a case of being less incentive for the individual voter to be knowledgeable. Things are changing so fast.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult to keep abreast of it. And I think this is something that we're going to see more and more of that, where we receive a lot more information about it, but we're overwhelmed with the changes because they're changing so fast. And so I think it's very difficult for somebody that's even an expert in the area to keep abreast of it, let alone somebody that is just looking out for their own personal situation.
If you're looking for comparisons to past presidential years, you have to look at 1960, 1968, and 1976. If you look at the percentage of votes by states, if you go back and compare elections from 1960 to 1984, for example, the Democrats have only carried California, I think, one time. That was in 1964 with the Johnson landslide. Over that period, for example, in California, the Democrats have only received 45.7% of the vote. In Texas, 45.3% of the vote. In, Michigan, 48% of the vote. They have carried states like New York State. The point is that the Democrats have done very, very poorly out west. And so you would, although a vice presidential candidate has not won the election since 1836 as a presidential candidate, so that's the record that George Bush confronts. The Democrats also don't have a very good record over the last 25, 30 years.
In presidential elections.
Right.
Isn't that a little bit misleading, though? I mean, certainly Republicans have to live down the Goldwater problem of 64, but when you look at the big Nixon win over McGovern, you look at the big Reagan wins, you look at the Democratic victories, other Democratic victory, which would be Jimmy Carter, was not by a huge margin. So what you have here are a few personalities, a Ronald Reagan, for example, and a George McGovern, who was a disaster for Democrats, really throwing the numbers out of sync. I mean, is this really a fair period?
Well, there might be something to be said for that, but isn't it the case that when you go into an election where you don't have an incumbent, such as, what would this be, like 1960? What was the other years we mentioned?
Or 1960. Well,
68.
68,
yeah.
okay. Isn't it true that almost inevitably it's going to be a toss-up?
Well,
Because, an incumbent president is going out,
yeah.
and
Or it's
you
more
have
likely to be a toss-up, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost by definition it's likely, because there's no incumbency. So it just becomes a toss-up almost by nature.
I think for a few minutes we ought to mention what the prospects are for Indiana politics. And I think the Democrats in Indiana are probably as unified as they've been since I've lived in this state, which has been about 12 years. Evan Bayh seems to be a candidate who can pull together the Larry Conrads, who was a candidate in 1976, Wayne Townsend, who was a candidate in
80 and 84.
80 and 84. So the Democrats in this state seem to be as potentially unified as they have been in some time. So that's good for the local
But it's
Democrats.
still
And
Indiana.
Bayh's a vote-getter. He's an affable, personable young man, very appealing.
But it's still Indiana. I mean, even in the good years for Democrats don't win Indiana.
Well, they have only won Indiana since 1930. I believe they won in 1936, and they also won in 1964. So, folks, one thing we can bet on is that Indiana's going Republican in 1988.
For the presidential election.
Right.
Anyway, certainly you have another situation with Republicans where Governor Orr cannot run for a third consecutive term. So you have some uncertainty there, although obviously John Mutz is going to be the nominee now that Bill Hudnett has stepped aside, but Democrats with Evan Bayh. So it's sort of like the presidential election. There is no one outstanding, let's give away the race right now, no one personality that's going to
Well, I think, and Bill can comment on this further, but the job that has been done on the international sphere in terms of Indiana certainly has to be credited somewhat to John Mutz. And it seems to me that John Mutz is very much like a Phil Sharp on the Democratic side. He's a very prepared, knowledgeable. He has a grasp of all the facts.
Not flashy, but
Not flashy.
But an awful lot of people recognize he was the man behind the scenes, and even beyond just the position involving international, that he was very significant.
And he'd appeal across lots of spectrums. But would that be
But
correct?
on the other hand, Evan Bayh appears to be a capable alternative. And he also has a generational pull, perhaps, in terms of influence.
I guess then it's really going to depend on whether Mutz can capitalize on the accomplishments in terms of the economics, like the Subaru plant in Lafayette area, and when you go on and on, look at all the different things that have been accomplished, really make political hay of that. Or is it a case where, on the other side, that they're able to really present their agenda and make the point very powerfully? So the thing that will be interesting to see is whether Mutz can overcome that the lack of flash. In other words, if he is not flashy enough, that's the thing that's going to be his come down or his
Bill,
pull
it
down.
certainly will not be for lack of money. He'll have plenty of money.
Well, he's got that, but I think you still have to have that ability to market yourself today. I don't think there's any question.
And you have a state that has not elected a Democratic governor since 1964, but sometimes likes to show a little independence and say, maybe we've had Republicans in the governor's seat too long. It's time to elect a Democrat, and Evan Bayh certainly is a fresh face in the Democratic Party now.
Sure, that's what I wanted to know, John. What would you say the odds are that Evan Bayh could pull it off? What are the odds of a Democratic governor?
Oh, I don't know. I just think he has a very good chance. As I recall, Wayne Townsend was able to get something like almost 49% of the vote last time. So given that situation, he should have at least that kind of opportunity.
But even in the good years for Democrats during the 70s, 74 was the only year that 74, and then in the 75, 76, the only years that Democrats held the House in Indiana, and then in 77, 78, the only 2 years the Democrats had the state Senate. So even if you have a Democratic governor, the chances are you are not going to have a completely Democratic legislature.
Right.
At best, you might capture one house.
I think one thing that the voters looked at Democrats and Republicans as political parties for, they looked at Democrats as a party that provides things for the public and protects various things like Social Security and that kind of thing. Whereas I think the past history of the last 25 years shows that Republicans tend to do better as protectors of the value of efficiency and perhaps effectiveness. So they like to put Republicans in order because although the Democrats are always voting in Congress to provide kinds of policies and programs and for education, for welfare, for middle class welfare especially, I'm saying, the Republicans tend to be the ones who, saying we shouldn't provide that much. So on one hand you have a political party that says let's cut back, and a second political party that says let's provide. And the voter tends to like that combination.
And what we've said here today is hedge your bets for 88. It's a year of uncertainty in economics and a year of uncertainty in politics. And we're out of time for today. Thanks to our panelists Bill Mosier, Cecil Bohannon, and John Rouse for their commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Mike Seaborg, Bill Mosier, Nancy Carlson, and Steve Johnson. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.